I spent few days using Expert RAW and Pro mode with the S21 Ultra, and I'm going to compare them. So I took 6 photos with both apps using the same camera settings, and I edited each of them according to what looked best to my eyes. Let's start easy with the first photos. The photo you're seeing is the raw photo from Pro mode. It was taken at the studio and I used the sunshine coming from the window to light the subjects. To my eyes, the brightest area of the photo is a bit overexposed and I find the picture to be a little bit reddish. So what I did was to create a tone curve to have a better control over the highlights and the shadows. I lowered down the exposure and I added a bit of contrast so that the image doesn't look too flat. And since the photo was a bit orange, I color graded the image by adding some blue to the shadow, and this is what I end up with. Let's have a look at the same picture taken with the Expert RAW. We can see that this time the brightest area is less harsh than in the previous photo and it's less reddish. So what I did was again to apply a tone curve to adjust the brightness more precisely. I lifted the shadow all the way up. I also added some contrast, and since the subject wasn't popping out enough from its environment, I used the brush tool to separate the subject from its environment, and that's my final edits. When looking at this photo side by side, we can see that the photo from Expert RAW handles the highlights better. The next shot is a photo of one of my dinner. The lighting was pretty bad, but it was a good way to challenge these two apps under bad conditions. With that photo, I wanted to create a moody matte feel to it. So I went on the tone curve to bring up the shadows. I added some contrast and some texture so we could see more of the texture of the food. I played around with the HSL tab to make the colors more vibrant, and here is what I ended up with. With Expert RAW, I found the raw photo to be a bit too flat. So the first thing I did was to add some contrast to the photo. Then I lifted up the shadows to recover some information from the dark areas. I also increased the amount of whites to bring a bit more brightness to the white parts of the photos. And I applied a gradient to tone down the shadow around this meal. And here is my final edits. When looking at these photos side by side, the difference isn't significant. The next shot was taken under harsh sunlight, and with Pro mode, we can see that the sky is totally washed out. So the first thing I did was to bring down the highlights to -100 to see if I could recover some of the sky. And I also adjusted the dehaze for the same purpose, but not too much, otherwise the contrast with the overexposed part of the sky would be too obvious. Then I added some contrast because the photo was a bit too flat to my eyes, and I played around with the orange, yellow and greens from the HSL panel to make the colors more vibrant. And this is what I ended up with. With Expert RAW, we can see that the sky isn't overexposed. So right off the bat, this is a scenario where we can see the difference between Expert RAW and Pro mode. Anyway, I dialed down the highlights to recover some of the colors of the sky. I played around with the dehaze to recover some of the shape of the clouds. Then I added some contrast and applied the color grading with some orange tone on the highlights and some blue tones on the shadows, and this is my final edits. When comparing with the previous photos, we can see that the dynamic range with Expert RAW is significantly better, and we can see the texture on the grass. On this shot, I am challenging the capacity of Expert RAW and Pro mode to capture moving subjects. So here, I'm gonna directly show the final edit directly and compare how both apps performed. In these two shots, both apps managed to capture the cars correctly. The subject wasn't blurred and the car was pretty fast. However, Expert RAW takes more time to capture photos, and it's capturing several pictures at different exposure before stacking them back together. And it makes it harder to capture the moment precisely, whereas with Pro mode, it captures the photo at the moment you hit the shutter button. So for moving subjects, Pro mode is the one to go, period. The next photo was taken outside under a rather good condition. We can see that the source of light is coming from the right and isn't burning the overall scenery. So all I needed to do basically was to play around with the colors and the shadows. So I first lifted up the shadows, then added a bit of contrast. On the HSL tab, I adjusted the saturation and luminance of the orange and the green. I applied the color grading with some blue tones in the shadows and some orange tones in the highlights. And after a few more adjustments, here is my final edits. The raw file from Expert Raw is more flat. The darkest part is brighter than on the previous raw photo. The first thing I did was to apply a tone curve to the photo so that the picture didn't look as flat. I adjusted the exposure, the shadows, and the contrast until I got the result I wanted. Then I went on the HSL tab to adjust the colors. Just like for the previous photo, I applied the color grading, and after a few more adjustments, here's what I got. Side by side with the previous edit, the difference is barely noticeable, but the dynamic range is actually better with Expert Raw. The last photo is a photo of my dog, and as you can see, the background behind the window is totally overexposed with Pro mode. So to fix the photos, I lowered down the highlights, lifted up the shadows so to recover some of the dark areas of my dog's face. I added some texture and clarity to increase the sharpness a little bit. And after a few more edits, here is what I ended up with. With Expert Raw, the background isn't overexposed, so there were just a few edits to make to increase the photo, like lifting up the shadows, adding some texture, applying a tone curve, and here's the final edits. Side by side, we can see that once again, the dynamic range with Expert Raw is better. The colors doesn't look as washed out as with Pro mode. And if we look at the purple pillow on the back, we can see that the color is more vibrant, and it only took few edits to achieve these results, where with Pro mode, I had to spend a bit more time to tweak the photo that doesn't look even good to my eyes. And that will be all for today's video. There are some other scenarios that I haven't covered, such as long exposure or low light shooting, but if you enjoyed the content, I will cover this part in the next video. Until then, thank you for watching. My name is Roman, and I'll see you guys in the next one.